So sometime this summer, I read a tweet from Scott Gottlieb. He said, just finished reading Josh Rogin's excellent book, Chaos Under Heaven. A colorful, detailed, provocative overview of the recent political struggles with China's government and the coming future ones. So Scott Gottlieb likes the book, and it's for sale out there, and Josh will sign it for you. So please give him some support. So a few things about Josh. Josh Rogin is a columnist for the Global Opinion section of the Washington Post and a political analyst with CNN. He is also the author of Chaos Under Heaven, Trump, Xi, and the Battle for the 21st Century. It was released March 2021 by Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. Previously, Josh has covered foreign policy and national security for Bloomberg View, Newsweek, The Daily Beast, Foreign Policy Magazine, Congressional Quarterly, Federal Computer Week magazine, and Japan's Asahi Shimbun. Sorry we didn't bring sushi tonight, we should have. Yeah. His work has been featured on outlets including NBC, ABC, CBS, Fox, MSNBC, NPR, and many more. Josh has been recognized with the Interaction Award for Excellence in International Reporting and as a finalist for the Livingston Award for Young Journalists. He has also received journalism fellowships from the Knight Foundation, the East West Center, and the National Press Foundation. Josh holds a BA in International Affairs from George Washington University and studied at Sophia University in Tokyo, Japan. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Allie Rogin, who works for PBS NewsHour. So without further ado, I'd like to have Josh come up and give his talk.
Hello. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. I really appreciate this. My book came out in March, and I've been doing almost exclusively Zooms, and so I'm not used to speaking about it while wearing pants. So bear with me. Thanks, Jeff. Now I owe a thanks to Dr. Scott Gottlieb, who I've never met, but first good thing that ever came out of Twitter, possibly, that brought me here tonight. Thank you, Kathleen. Thanks to the whole Guy family, actually, for setting this up. Thanks to the World Affairs Council, International Affairs Forum. I was in the World Affairs Council when I was in high school in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I did the Model UN and all of that stuff. So to come back and speak to our World Affairs Council 20 years later is really, really special. It's really special to be here in Traverse City. I'm sorry to admit that I've actually never been here before, and I'm a little bit kicking myself now that I didn't plan a longer stay and bring my wife, although I'm told that, she would be able to indulge her wine hobby a little bit too easily here, so I'm a little bit concerned. No, we'll have to come back another time, and I hope I'll see some of you back then. The connection to Michigan that means something to me is that when I was a very young reporter, younger at least, working for Congressional Quarterly, in the mid-aughts, my job was to cover a very senior senator by the name of Carl Levin, and he was the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I was the beat reporter at Congressional Quarterly covering the Senate Armed Services Committee, and I interacted with him every day for years. And for those of you who remember that back then, there was a whole slate of senior senators who were statesmen who put country above party and who put country above politics, and he was at the top of the list. And he was just he was a great legislator, but he really was a great American and a great human. Many a time he would sit with me and in his inner office and lay out maps of like the Iraqi provinces and explain to me why he was funding this or what he didn't have to do that. He was just he was what we call in my family a mensch. He was a good guy, and we miss him, but we also miss people like him in Washington now. So that's my story is a little bit different than most journalists because, as you may have heard, I started as a failed Japan scholar. That's the truth of it. I was going to school in Washington. I went to school in Tokyo for a little while. I wanted to study U.S.-Japan relations. That was all I wanted to do, just to eat ramen. I don't know if you guys like ramen. And I actually have a ramen Instagram website. It's very famous. It's called Watch the Ramen. If you guys want to follow it, don't worry about it. And I would go back and forth to Japan, and I lived there for a year after college, about a year and a half, and I learned Japanese, and I sort of, I wanted to get a job studying Japan. And I got back to Washington after living there for a couple of years, and nobody wanted to pay me for that at all. And Japan is like one of those countries that's like basically like going to be fine. People don't worry about it too much, so nobody wants to pay you to study it. So I chose the wrong country, but I loved it there. And the job that I did find was working at the Japanese newspaper. It's called the Asahi Shimbun. And in their D.C. bureau, they had a bunch of Japanese journalists who didn't speak English, and I spoke Japanese, so they hired me. And the first day I got there, they said, go to the Pentagon. And I said, why? They said, you're the Pentagon reporter. I said, are you sure? They're like, yeah, go ahead. I'm like, okay, what do I do? They said, okay, here's what you do. And this is 2004, so at that time the Pentagon was led by a guy named Donald Rumsfeld. You may remember. Also recently passed. And Rumsfeld, he was a character, right? It's not like today where, the press conferences are pretty routine and basically worthless. Back then, he would tell you anything you wanted to know. He loved it. He loved not to say that I agreed with all of his policies, but he lived for those press conferences. So I went over there, I was 24, and I had a little notebook, and I got there early, and I sat in the front row, and my bosses said, if he calls on you for any reason, whatever you do, just ask him anything about Japan. Whatever he says about Japan, that's going to be huge news for our newspaper. Like, okay, fine. So I went up, sat in the front row, and, it's talking about Iraq and Abu Ghraib and where's Osama bin Laden and are the troops coming home, when are the troops coming home? And, he's getting a little frustrated, and he calls on me, and I asked him about something about Japan. I can't even remember what it was, and his face lights up. And he talked about Japan for 35 minutes. And he drained the entire press conference. And all of the other big shot reporters were like super pissed off at me because like, who's this kid in the front row taking away our time to ask about where's Osama bin Laden for the 47th time? And I was like, I came back to my Japanese bosses with a full notebook full of Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense, talking about Japan. Front page news in 7 million Japanese newspapers that I couldn't read. And I said, what do I do now? They said, well, do it again tomorrow. So for 3 years, I was Donald Rumsfeld's foil inside that press room. And anytime he called on me, I would reliably change the subject to U.S.-Japan relations. And we were breaking news all over Japan, although nobody in Washington knew it because nobody reads Japanese. And one day I didn't ask him anything, and he stopped me after in like the hallway of the Pentagon. I didn't even think he knew my name, and he said, "Josh, what are you, tired today? I could have used you in there." And that's when I knew the fix was in. And with this like shit-eating grin on his face, So I was like, okay, now we're in business. So we did that for about 3 years. I hit what I like to call the rice paper ceiling. That's like if you're the American kid at the Japanese newspaper, there's no upward mobility for you. You're rising through the ranks of the company. So I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? So I applied for more Japan jobs, consulting, think tanks. Didn't get any of them. But I got a job working for this trade publication called Federal Computer Week magazine. Sounds a little weird, but at that time it was a great job. And it was a trade publication covering the federal IT industry. And in D.C., that's huge business, billions of dollars worth of business even back then. And I knew how to cover the Pentagon, and I knew something about Asia because I had lived there. So I just started digging, and I started breaking stories. Because for young journalists, especially in D.C. these days, they don't really train you. They don't really tell you how to do things. You could be very clever, you could be really aggressive, you could be very quick, you could be very smart. But the trade craft of journalism is kind of like a lost art. But because I had worked with these Japanese journalists who were at the top of their game, I knew how to dig, I knew how to use data, I knew how the government worked, and I just started breaking stories, mostly about China. And I was noticing inside of the Defense Department in places like Fort Belvoir, I used to go to Montgomery, Alabama, or Net Warfare Command, or all of these different bases where I saw these people dealing with this thing called China in lots of different ways. They weren't talking to each other. It was all siloed. They didn't know what to do, and there wasn't really a public discussion about what they saw as a rising threat from inside the system. But I started to write about it, and I started to break stories. I got a more prestigious job working for Congressional Quarterly, and then Foreign Policy Magazine, and then Daily Beast, and then Newsweek, and then Bloomberg, and then the Washington Post. And, all of that time, let's say from 2004 until 2016, there was this sort of bubbling up discussion inside Washington, not just Washington, but mostly inside Washington, about what many people inside the government and outside the government saw as a China that was becoming increasingly militarily aggressive, increasingly using technology to spy on us and to steal our technology, increasingly using its influence in our politics, increasingly showing up in our universities and our tech companies, in ways that weren't necessarily malign, but that were new and were presented challenges for our national security. But there was no consensus on what to do about it. And all through this time, there was a debate raging inside the government and on Capitol Hill, actually, about sort of, have we lost this bet, the grand bet? And I'm going to simplify it a little bit, but basically the bet was, back in 1999, when we let China into the WHO, gave it permanent trade relations status, that if we just engage with China, if we just cooperate with the Chinese government, if we integrate China into our systems, invest in them, let them invest in us, give them a lot of help and encouragement, that China would liberalize, and that the Chinese government would liberalize, first economically, and that would then cause them to liberalize politically, and that would solve all of our problems, and we would avoid a Cold War, or Thucydides trap, or some sort of clash as China rises and America falls. And even in 2004, when I started doing this, there were some people inside the system who were like, wait a minute, I don't really think that's happening. And not because it wasn't a good bet to make, not because we didn't want to engage with China, not because we didn't want to set up a situation where the Chinese government felt like it could engage with us, but because China was just decided to go another way. But still, that wasn't the consensus. And still, basically, the policy was, no, we have to just engage. And maybe we're not engaging enough. Maybe we're not investing enough. Maybe we're not tying them into our systems enough. And that sort of debate raged on until sort of the middle of the Obama administration. And at that point, that was when Xi Jinping came to power, and things changed. And first inside the government, things changed, but then all over the country, people started to realize that this bet was being lost. Again, not because we didn't make it honestly, not because we didn't believe in good relations between the U.S. and China. Of course, that's what we all should want, but because the Chinese government had decided to go in another direction. And, we have this, but even at that time, at the end of the Obama administration, there was a reluctance to talk about that in public, much less do anything about it. But you could tell that there was a struggle. And, what I saw inside the system was an effort to sort of tamp down the concerns and encourage the engagement as a last-ditch effort to see if this bet could be pulled off. That's what the Obama administration was doing, especially at the end. And we have this thing in the U.S. government where my intelligence friends always say the same thing. They say, well, the Chinese government has a great encryption system. They put things in their own language, and then no one ever reads them, and we never figure out what was happening. But for the people who were inside the system, who were reading what Xi Jinping was saying and looking at what he was doing, it seemed pretty clear that he was turning the Chinese government and the Chinese society, in a way, in a direction that was not only different from what we had wanted, but in a way that was increasingly threatening our national security and our economic prosperity and, yes, even our public health. And there was a lot of debate about what to do about it. But the policy in Washington especially was controlled by a very small number of people. And even at that time, they didn't want to relinquish that. And those people had 40 years of this bet that they were invested in. If you spent your life as a China hand or an academic or a business person or whatever, and your career was based on this idea, well, that's a very hard thing to give up. And then something crazy happened. Donald Trump got elected president. And that changed everything. I mean, for everything, really, right? All of our lives changed. But for the China community, the China watching community in Washington, this was unprecedented because, Donald Trump campaigned on reorienting the U.S. relationship with China. His theory of the case, which he wrote or had somebody write into several of his books, was that China had been screwing us on trade for 30 years, and he was the guy to fix it. And it was a huge part of his campaign. And the people that he had surrounded himself with at that time, like Steve Bannon, Peter Navarro, and Stephen Miller, and some others, they were very intent on making that happen right out of the gate. And the Chinese knew that, and they were very upset about that. And most people in Washington, or maybe even around the country, weren't thinking about that when Trump was, when he won the election, quite unexpectedly. Everyone was talking about Russia. You remember Russiagate and the meetings and the calls and Jeff Sessions and all that stuff and Mike Flynn. And I can talk about that in the question and answer if you really want to, but my reaction at that time, I was just getting to the Washington Post, got this great new job, I'm feeling good about it, and Trump gets elected and everyone's like, Russia, and I said to my boss, wait a second, what about the China story? I think that's going to be the story. And he's like, oh, really? Why do you think that? I'm like, well, because look at all these things that are happening. I've been covering it for a long time. And at the Washington Post, we had 50 people working on the Russiagate story, and nobody working on the China story. Nobody. I mean, there were a couple people in China who were doing very brave work, but basically in Washington, there was this guy, right? And so I was like, and it was a risky thing to do at the time because I just got this new job, and I said to my boss, Fred Hyatt, I want to spend the next 4 years covering Trump in China. That's what I want to spend all my time doing. And he said to me, okay, what do you need? And I said, well, I need the time not to cover the Russiagate story. I think it's covered. I think Washington Post has got that covered. That's going to be fine or not. I need a ticket around the world, go to Asia as many times as I need to go. And he said, okay. And then he said, where do you want to go first? And I said, Dharamsala, India, to see the Dalai Lama. And he looked at me and he said, I hope you find enlightenment. And I backed out of the room slowly before he changed his mind. So that's what I did. I went to see the Dalai Lama in Dharamsala and spent a week there with the Tibetans. And that was the beginning of sort of like, just really, really digging into the story in a way that I never had an opportunity to do with any other story in my whole life. And I knew it was going to be crazy. I didn't know how nuts it was going to be. I didn't know how crazy it was going to be. But I knew it was going to be nuts. And I knew I had some sources because what had happened in that time was all of those people inside the government who I just told you about, who were calling for a new China policy, that, we're talking about full disclosure, I got that young professional. I'm not that young anymore. That was a long time ago. So now the young China hands had become middle-aged China hands, and they saw this Trump administration as a great opportunity because they didn't care about the Russia stuff. They're like, oh, wait, this is going to be disruptive. This is going to be, all bets are off. And here's a president who says he wants to confront China. Let's see if that's true. So inside the government, there was a huge turnover, and all of the sort of more hawkish people in China were like, oh, wait, this is my chance. And if I'm ever going to get a chance to do what I want, if you're in the Justice Department or the FBI or the State Department or whatever, the CIA or Congress, well, it's open season because Trump administration is totally not all bets. It's completely, there's no rules anymore, right? And that's exactly what happened. So now you had all of these new people with a different perspective in all these places in government, and they started to fight all these battles. And then at the top of the administration, you had all new people too. But that broke the other way because what the Chinese government thought was that Steve Bannon was going to be running our China policy, right? That's what I thought, at least at the beginning, but it wasn't the case. Because once Trump became president, he brought in all these other people like Steve Mnuchin, Reince Priebus, H.R. McMaster. All these people have very different views. Wilbur Ross, and they're all characters too, characters in the book and characters in life. And immediately what happened is they all went to war with each other inside the system and then at the top of the political level. And, again, in Washington, it's really easy to cover the top 10 people that are in the government. You can cover the president, the vice president. You can get people to leak on what they're doing, what they're saying. Covering the machine of foreign policy, how things work on the inside, that's a lot more difficult. But that was my specialty, so that's what I concentrated on. And those two things interact with each other in various unpredictable and crazy ways. And in the Trump administration, it was even more crazy because everyone was freelancing. So what ended up happening was a huge fight over America's foreign policy over China emerged. And in many ways, that fight is still happening today. And, people sometimes simplify it and they say, oh, well, you had the hawks and the doves, or the panda huggers and the panda sluggers, or the red team and the blue team, or the appeasers and the confronters, or something like that. But it's not that simple. The truth is that there were 6 factions on China inside the Trump administration. There were the Super Hawks. These are the people like Bannon and Navarro and Stephen Miller, and they thought that, basically the CCP is a genocidal, socialist, nationalist, fascist group of thugs that need to be brought down right now. That's what they think. I'm not saying that's what I think. I'll tell you what I think. It's not exactly what I think anyway. And their theory was, look, these guys are coming for us, and if they're willing to do a genocide against their own people, imagine what they're willing to do to us. And the thing we need to do right now is to bring them down. Now, I don't think that's the right policy. I'm not here to say. I'm just saying that's what Bannon thought. He used to say, "CCP delenda est," right? That's a take on Carthage delenda est. It means the CCP must be destroyed. Okay. Then you had another group. The group is I call the hardliners in the book. The hardliners are people who want a tougher China policy, but not a war, not a Cold War, not to bring down the Chinese Communist Party, but just to rebalance the relationship. The theory of this group was that, we just let it slip too far. We gave them too much. We didn't protect ourselves enough. We gave them an inch. They took a mile. Now we have to fix all this stuff that we let languish all these years. The trade subsidies, the IP theft, the cyber hacking, the Wall Street stuff, the frauds, their interference in our schools, in our tech companies, in our media, on Wall Street, all of it, sports, and we just can't have that anymore. But we still have to live with these guys, and we're all sharing one globe, so we have to figure out a way to all live together, but that's going to mean rebalancing the relationship, and then they're not going to like that. So that was people like Mike Pence and, Robert O'Brien and Mike Pompeo, and, there's a guy named Matt Pottinger you might have heard of. He was the Deputy National Security Advisor. If you read the book, you'll find he had a very influential role in this. So that's another group. Then you had the Wall Street guys, led by Steve Mnuchin and Larry Kudlow, and later, Gary Cohn earlier on. And these guys thought the opposite thing. They said, no. The only thing we need to do now is engage with China more. And actually, the way out of this mess is to integrate us more. And we have to double down on this policy. And, that's a very, pro-business, sort of pro-Wall Street stance. And it was shared by a lot of people in the Treasury Department and in the National Economic Council who thought, what are you, crazy? We're going to, try to fight the Chinese as they're rising. They're obviously going to be the biggest economy. If you can't beat them, join them. And then there was the bureaucrats. There were a lot of people inside the U.S. government who hated the Trump people for a lot of understandable reasons, but it wasn't really about China. They just didn't like the Trump people. So they fought all the stuff from the inside. And I forget what the other, there were a couple more factions. Anyway, they all went to war with each other. And this created total chaos. So that's why the book is called Chaos Under Heaven. The title is a quote from Mao, although we couldn't really prove that Mao actually said it, but he's said to have said it. And the quote goes something like this. It's, there is great chaos under heaven. The situation is excellent. And what that means is the more that we're in chaos, the better it is for them. At that time, the Communist Party of China was talking about the Japanese or the Kuomintang or whoever. But now they're talking about us. And it means that the more divided we are inside of our own society, the harder it is going to be to meet this challenge, which is a shared challenge. And the subtitle of the book is Trump, Xi, and the Battle for the 21st Century. And what that means is that, the argument of the book is not that we should do one thing or another thing, but that this is the most important thing in our foreign policy. This is the most important issue in the world in terms of foreign policy that any of us will deal with. That's my argument for the rest of our lives, because it affects us in every aspect of our lives, more or less. And increasingly, it affects us in malign ways. And this sort of gets to the other part of the book, which is really not about the Trump people. Like, the publishers, they just want, like, crazy Trump anecdotes. He said crazy stuff. I've got plenty of that. He said a lot of crazy stuff. It's all in the book. But I tried to devote a lot of the rest of the book to talking about what's going on with the China challenge outside of Washington. And what I found was, at the same time people were having this discussion inside the FBI or inside Congress or inside the Defense Department, that this discussion about what to do about China was happening in various institutions in American society, and inside our universities, and inside our tech companies, and inside our Wall Street firms, and inside our NBA teams, and inside of our Hollywood studios. And they were all sort of grappling with the same big idea, which is, wait a minute, what if it's the case that the Chinese Communist Party is not benign? What if it's the case that China's rise does affect us? What if it's the case that the actions of Xi Jinping and his cohort impact our lives in a negative way? What do we do about that? That's a big problem. And so all those conversations were siloed, and those institutions weren't talking to each other. And when the Trump administration went to your average university and said, hey, we need to talk to you about the Chinese Communist Party, and we're going to need to see all your books on all your donations, and we need to see the research grants that you had and see if there's any Chinese spies in your labs, almost universally, the response was you. That's because in America, our institutions guard their privacy and their independence fiercely and rightly. That's our system. And one of the big reveals of the China story is that what's going on the Chinese side, and we can talk more about this, is that everything's increasingly controlled by the party. And what Xi Jinping has done is he's asserted the party's control over all sectors of society. You see it in the news. Now they're banning online gaming. Now they're controlling the tutoring industry. Now they're shutting down the ride-sharing companies. Now they're shutting down the social media companies. And that took a long time for people in Washington and around the country to realize that, oh, wait, on their side, it's all connected. Again, if you read Chinese, and I don't read Chinese, by the way, but I hired 2 excellent researchers who translated all these documents, which show very simply that this is what Xi Jinping is doing, and we know that because that's what he's saying. So it didn't always go well, and for a lot of understandable reasons, the Trump administration and all of these institutions clashed. But at the same time, inside of all of these campuses and tech companies, there were interesting stories going on, so I tried to report them out as much as possible. And the stories are about Chinese influence and Chinese Communist Party influence in our society. And that's a difficult and complicated thing to talk about because it's designed to be a difficult and complicated thing to talk about. In other words, when we talk about the integrity of our democracy and the integrity of our institutions, it's hard to admit that there's another country that's attacking that, that's trying to undermine that. But that's the case that we have here. And, once you've come to the conclusion that, oh, wait, there is and people sort of get it with the Russian stuff, right? And now it's sort of like, okay, they're messing with our politics to divide us, to exacerbate the divisions in our society, to weaken our democracy to their advantage because they mean us harm, right? Now it's sort of easy to think about that. In 2016, it was a really hard thing to really understand. What I'm saying is that the Chinese influence machine is very different from the Russian machine. It's in order of magnitude more complicated. It's an order of magnitude more dangerous. And the reason is because it's not based on Twitter bots only or Facebook groups only or sending money to this candidate who thinks of this or that, although that does happen. It's about seeding our institutions with tons and tons of cash and building relationships over decades with leaders in both sides of the party in all sorts of sectors of American society. And again, the reason that we know this is because they wrote it in their own language. It's a system called the United Front, and this is a lot of the book is devoted to this. And it dates back to Maoist times, and it's described in Maoist terms as striking the party's enemies by using the party's friends. And basically what the party does is they have an infrastructure called the United Front Work Department. And they've got billions, and it's not just America, by the way, they do this in every country around the world. And they seed institutions with cash. And they'll buy off anyone who will get bought off. And sometimes it's a benign investment and sometimes it's not. But once they have those relationships, you can be sure that they're going to use them. And, talking about that is very difficult because, all of these institutions, especially our campuses, but also our companies, have crossing interests, right? We want to welcome Chinese students to our campuses. We don't want to become the thing that we're fighting. We want to stay open and pluralistic and kind to outsiders, and we want to welcome, exchanges, and we want to talk to the Chinese people. At the same time, there's a threat there because the party is using its engagement with us against us. So and we can talk about this in the Q&A too if you want, but, just to use universities as one example, we have these things called Confucius Institutes. Maybe you've heard of them. They're Chinese government, actually CCP-sponsored cultural and language centers on American campuses. There used to be over 100 of them on American campuses. There's like 1,000 of them around the world. And what they are is sort of a Chinese Communist Party outpost inside of a campus, a U.S. campus. Now, is that a bad thing or a good thing, right? Is that something that we need to stop, or is that something we need to keep an eye on? Well, that's a very complicated thing because, again, we want academic freedom, and we want the money that brings, and there's a ton of money that comes with those institutes, and we want the relationships on the other side that gets you, but we don't want, our students censored. We don't, and so it's a case-by-case thing. On some campuses, it was fine. I went to the George Washington University, so I joined the George Washington University Confucius Institute. I just signed up as an alumnus, and they thought it was a little weird because I'm the only 40-year-old guy at the reception at the bar, and they're like, Josh, why do you want to take Chinese 101? You're pretty old. I'm like, I think education is a lifelong endeavor. That's what I told them, and I was trying to suss out to see if there was any malign influence there, and there wasn't. Okay, it was just a bunch of people learning Chinese, as far as I could tell. But that's because in Washington, D.C., you don't need to put your spies at the Confucius Institute. It's Washington. There's spies everywhere. All right, you can't swing a cat without hitting a couple spies in Washington. You need to hide them in a Confucius Institute. At University of West Florida, the FBI found out that they had put intelligence collectors there because that's a great place to hide them in that environment. In another school, I think it was UC San Diego, they banned the Dalai Lama from coming because the Chinese Student Association protested. Right? Oh, the Dalai Lama is a terrorist. Like, really? Okay, we can't have the Dalai Lama. In Maryland, there was the Student Association was spying on the Chinese students. So Chinese students come here. If they're here, if they're on our soil, they have free speech, but not if they're getting watched by these organizations. So a Chinese student gave a speech about how great it was to breathe the fresh air of freedom, and she was on the next plane back. We never heard from her again. So that's a complicated thing. Now, I could tell the same story for the tech companies, right? So I started talking to all these Silicon Valley tech companies for the book. I was like, well, we should all be talking to each other. And what I found was a very complicated, messy picture because all the tech companies were different. And a lot of them also woke up to the challenge that they were in real time as we were going through this. Facebook is a good example. So, Mark Zuckerberg did everything he could to kiss up to Xi Jinping. I remember when he came to the White House and he learned enough Chinese to ask Xi Jinping to give a Chinese name to his firstborn child, and Xi Jinping was like, no, I'm not going to do that. But he was trying. He was doing everything he could, and he would go back and forth to China, try to figure it out. Eventually, he realized that they were never going to let Facebook into China. They're just not going to do it. Why would they do that? And he turned, and now Mark Zuckerberg realized that TikTok is actually coming for him. And that it's not really about him getting access to the Chinese market. It's about him protecting his business from the Chinese tech companies. That's different. That's new. That wasn't like that 10 years ago. And he switched. Now he came to Washington, gave a big speech about human rights and liberal democracy and open society. He doesn't care about any of that stuff. He realizes that actually the threat to his business is not market access in China, or it's that the Chinese tech industry is actually very robust and presents a real challenge for him. Not in China, but here. So now his business is threatened here. Apple's a totally different story. They're essentially a corporate hostage of the CCP because they control all of their manufacturing and 40% of their iPhone business, and that's a tough position to be in. I get it, but what they've done is they've taken the opposite approach, and they kowtow to the Chinese Communist Party at every opportunity. And it happens all the time because the Chinese government knows that they have them. They know that they've got them where they want them. So if they ask them to remove the Hong Kong app from the protest store, Hong Kong protest app from the iTunes store, Apple's got to do it. A couple months ago, Apple released a new privacy setting, right, where you can have more control over your data. That's a good thing, but the Chinese platforms that work with Apple on iPhones in China, they said, no, we're not going to do it. We're not going to follow your rules. What are you going to do about it? And there's nothing they can do about it. Because if they cross them, then they'll just lose 40% of their business. They can't do it. Wall Street is a really interesting one. It's probably the worst one, actually, because at the same time that all of these industries in Congress and the administration are all sort of moving towards first a acknowledgement, then a sort of debate, and then sort of an action against what to do about rising China and how it affects their industry, Wall Street was rowing in the other direction. And what most of the New York Wall Street firms have been doing is drastically increasing their investments in China, and they're systematically increasing their the passive investments that all of us are making in China. And when I started to delve into this, could be a whole book by itself. It was really crazy because what I discovered, was that not only in Washington, where the representatives of Wall Street and their lobbyists were thwarting China, tough on China approaches. If there's a sanctions against the Uyghurs, or if there's like a trade, tariff, you can be sure the corporate lobbyists for Wall Street are against that. But at the same time, what they were doing is they were tying themselves to their Chinese counterparts as quickly and as egregiously as possible. And what that means for all of us is really interesting because, I don't know about you, but I don't manage my pension fund, right? I have a pension fund. I assume whoever's managing it is doing good. I don't really know. I'm not picking the stocks. And, most people operate that way. And most big institutional investors, whether it's a state pension fund or the military's pension fund or, educational institutions endowment, that's all passively managed. And I know there's a lot of finance people in the audience, so you'll understand exactly what I'm talking about. A lot of that is passively tracking a lot of the Wall Street indexes, and you have indexes like MSCI and FTSE Russell and Bloomberg Barclays, and what they do is they create these lists, and the holdings on the list drive the passive investments, trillions of dollars. We talk about millions or billions. This is trillions of dollars that track major Wall Street indexes. And as I'm watching this, the indexes are drastically increasing their holdings. MSCI went from like 2% to 7%. They're on the way to 20% of Chinese holdings. Now, when that happens, every pension fund that tracks that index increases its holdings of Chinese stocks or Chinese A shares or whatever. And so what they're doing is funneling hundreds of billions of dollars into the Chinese companies, including the ones that are building the concentration camps, including the ones that are building the cameras that sit atop the concentration camp walls, including the ones that are hacking our military, and including the ones that are building the islands and building the missiles that go on the islands that are pointed at us, and the ships that are carrying those missiles. So the greatest transfer of wealth and power in human history is not actually intellectual property theft, where like the Chinese hack Intel. It's actually coming from Wall Street, and it's actually getting worse. We can get back to that if you want. This caused another series of clashes between the government and inside the government, which I tried to document as well as I could. And that got us into the trade war, and the trade war became a tech war, and then the tech war became a systems battle. People like to throw around the term Cold War, right? You hear like, are we in a new Cold War? Is that what we're dealing with, right? And for the Chinese government, that's the thing that they say to warn you against confronting them. Like, what, you crazy Americans, you don't want a Cold War, do you? And, so what I kind of say to that is two things. One is that, no, it's not the Cold War. It's not, because the Cold War was a specific thing, and the Soviet Union is not China. It's different, right? It's that we're more interconnected with China, as we should be, as we're going to continue to be. They're much more powerful than the Soviet Union was. They're richer than the Soviet Union. They're richer than we are, and so it's a different kind of challenge. And the Cold War was very military focused, right? And this competition is really economically and technologically and ideologically focused. That's different. So it's not the Cold War, but there are things that we can learn from the Cold War. And the scope and scale of the challenge is a Cold War level challenge in the sense that it affects us in all of our lives in really every country in the world. And in that sense, we're going to have to deal with it for a generation. So we could think about it as a Cold War. I like to say a systems battle, a battle between the system that they're putting forward, state-driven, totalitarian, controlled economies, controlled people, controlled press, controlled society, versus what we enjoy, which is an open society where, more or less we can choose our leaders, more or less we can say what we want, more or less you can choose what you want to do. You can choose where you want to work. You can choose who you want to love. And to me, that's the challenge. And is that the Cold War? No, but it's a Cold War level kind of challenge. And so what that only leads you to is like, okay, well, if we don't want a Cold War with China, then what can we do and how can we avoid it? And I think it's a really important question because, there's a chance that we could overreact, and we can't act like the Chinese are 10 feet tall, and we can't put up walls around our society and just not let them in, and we can't live in a world where we're all divided. So how do you have a world where the U.S. and China can live together, at the same time we don't slip into a conflict? At the same time, we don't give up the things that we love, like our freedom and our national security and our public health. These are big challenges that I think really in Congress and in our government we're really failing to tackle honestly, which is sort of why I wrote the book. I wanted to bring everyone to a base level of conversation and knowledge so that not to say that you have to think what I think, just to say that this is a problem that affects us all. And we have to have a national discussion about it. We can't leave it to the China hands, and we can't leave it to the government because that didn't work. And this has to be a national conversation, and it's going to be a tough one, and we're only just beginning. And what I say about that is sort of like, first of all, the Cold War is not really the worst option. You know, we don't want a Cold War, but it's really not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is a hot war, right? And hot war is much worse than a Cold War. And, you know, there's another way that this could turn out, which is that we don't have a Cold War, we don't have a hot war, but we just don't do anything. And we just let the Chinese Communist Party become so big and powerful that we can't tell them what to do anymore. And then we can't have, you know, a school that has the Dalai Lama come to town, and we can't have a tech company that has privacy, and we can't have, you know, the NBA, you know, with a manager who makes one tweet for Hong Kong without the entire NBA getting punished. You guys remember that NBA story? And this was really important when I was sort of following the story, because there are these watershed moments in our culture where the China challenge becomes very apparent to millions of people all at once. And the NBA was kind of the biggest one that I saw over the last 4 years. Because one tweet, Daryl Morey, he issued one tweet, "Stand with Hong Kong." Just for that one tweet, the NBA got punished to the tune of, what, $400 million? All of their games in China were canceled, all of their T-shirt sales, all their jersey sales. You know, we're talking, I mean, it starts adding up to real money, right? This is the biggest scandal in sports history. And the reason that example was so shocking to many people is because millions of Americans for the first time realized that the Chinese Communist Party will punish us for exercising our rights in our country. So you could tweet something in America, you've never been to China, but they're going to punish your whole team, your whole company, maybe the whole industry, until they kneel, until you promise that no one from the NBA will ever tweet anything that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't like. That's crazy. We can't live like that, because you never know what they're going to get offended by. And, you know, what that represents is the Chinese Communist Party taking what it calls its social credit system, right? We have credit, but our credit is like, does the bank think you're going to pay back your loan? It's not, are you pledging allegiance to the dear leader? That's the difference, right? The Chinese Communist Party will say, well, you guys have credit, don't you? Yeah, but our credit is based on, you know, economics or law. It's not based on politics. And their social credit system is based on ideology, which means you have to, you know, download the program for Xi Jinping's thought. And then you have to fill out the quiz once every day. And if you don't, you're not going to be able to get on a train that day. And, oh, your company has to spend 40% of its time developing a software that praises the Chinese Communist Party propaganda. Okay, that's their country. That's a problem, but that's terrible. But where it really affects me is when they say, oh, now we can't tweet. You can't tweet what you want in the U.S. We're going to punish your whole company. Well, millions of Americans were like, oh, wow, we can't have that. You know, that's not going to work. And all of a sudden, millions of people sort of realized that the pickle that we're in. Now, for me, the NBA story was really hit home, because when the Rockets came to town in Washington, I went to the first opening game, and there was a group out front of Uyghurs, right? They were mostly American activists, young people, about 20 of them. They spelled Google Uyghurs on their shirts, right? And they were stalled for a while because the guy who had the Y, he had to go to the bathroom. They eventually got it together, and they came into the game, and they called me. They're like, "Hey, Josh, we're going to do this. Can you come cover it? We'd like to get some attention." But they didn't need me. They were chanting out in front of the arena in Washington, you know, Google Uyghurs, free Hong Kong, educate LeBron. They were pissed off at LeBron James, right? Because LeBron James reacted to the NBA scandal, and he said, oh, well, Daryl Morey isn't educated about the issue. That's what he said. And Daryl Morey, by the way, is a PhD in statistics and worked for the CIA and developed the Moneyball research. You know, ever seen Moneyball? He helped develop that. He's smarter than everybody in this room put together. And so he knew exactly what he was doing. He's a Washington guy. But LeBron said, oh, well, you know, Daryl Morey wasn't educated about Hong Kong because he wanted to protect Space Jam 2, right? So he wanted to be released. The funny postscript to that story is they didn't release Space Jam 2 in China. They screwed him over anyway. So LeBron James didn't even get the thing that he. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The point is that these young Uyghur activists saw that awakening in the eyes and the minds of millions of Americans to the reality of what we're dealing with the CCP, and they saw it as an opportunity to get some attention for their cause. And their cause was that each and every single one of them had family members in concentration camps. And it's probably not a coincidence, but most of them were artists, their family members who were in the concentration, or politicians, journalists, writers, academics, and they'd all been scooped up. And over the course of a couple years, disappeared. Their fathers, their mothers, their aunts and uncles. No trials, no nothing. No like, oh, well, you'll go to the education center, you'll be fine in a couple months. Just gone. And these people are desperate. You know, they're trying to get some attention for their cause. And that led me to sort of spend a lot of time talking to Uyghurs, you know, because in the end, you know, whether you're pro-engagement or pro-competition or pro-confrontation, it's really hard to ignore genocide. And I use that word intentionally, and I know that there's some controversy over that word. And, you know, the legal term genocide is defined by the UN as a specific thing. It means the intent to destroy a group in whole or in part, right? You don't have to destroy the whole group, just part of it's okay, but it's also the intent. So what some people will say is, well, we don't know what their intent is. Maybe they're destroying the Uyghurs because they're destroying. I know that's just the way they do business now. But for me, it wasn't really about the legal definition. It was about these people, these young activists who I met, who all their family members were gone. And I started to report on it more, and it just got. I started to interview more victims and more family members and then there started to be survivors, because with any genocide, with any mass atrocity, there's always survivors. And the longer they go on, the more survivors come out to tell their stories. And the Uyghur story is harrowing, and it's a little bit depressing, but it's important to hear it because it's happening on our watch. And what had happened was, you know, these young activists, their family members were like the elite Uyghurs. They were like the educated ones. They got scooped up first, disappeared first. Then they brought the huge surveillance and monitoring to Xinjiang, the province where all the Uyghurs live, right? There's other people there too, but, you know, let's say 12 million Uyghurs, 20 million other people. And so these people were living in an open-air prison, every move monitored, everywhere they go, checking in. You know, if you eat some pork or you go to the mosque, boom, you're off to the camp. Then you go to the camp, and there's no, you know, you don't see your family. There's no way to get out. There's no hearings. There's no trials. There's no nothing. You're just there until they tell you that you can leave. Sometimes it was months. Sometimes it was years. Sometimes the people never got out. We don't know what happened to them. Those who are lucky to get out, well, then your nightmare is just beginning, because then you've got to go to the factory. What factory? Shut up. Get in the car. We'll take you to the factory. Now you're stitching together Nikes or picking cotton for the rest of your life. You're not, you know, you're not in jail, but you can't go home. What about my kids? What do you mean, what about your kids? Well, I had a newborn baby before I went into the camp. Well, we had to send them to an orphanage thousands of miles away. You'll never see them again. Maybe you will, maybe you won't. Well, you know, are they slaves? Well, no, we're going to pay you, but you don't have a choice. You better be at that factory. You better be picking that cotton. And that is a level of cruelty and atrocity that's pretty awful, you know, by any standard, no matter what legal definition you use. And as the stories kept coming out, this affected the China discussion because, you know, human rights people, it didn't matter who you were. A lot of people were horrified, including me. I was horrified by this. And I just kept interviewing more and more of these people to get more of the information. So all of this was happening, and I was like, you know, this is a crazy story. I think I never wrote a book before. I think I got a book here. You know, I think this is enough for a book, right? And I think this is important, and I want to try to do this. So, you know, I got my agent. We met with a bunch of publishers. You know, wrote a proposal, got a contract. Okay, now I got to write the book. I got the contract. This is good. And sit down to write the book in like November 2019. Then the pandemic hit. And the pandemic changed everything, right? It changed the event that we're having here today. It changed all of our lives in ways that we have yet to really comprehend or still struggle to understand, in ways that haven't presented themselves to us. But it definitely changed the U.S.-China relationship right from the jump. And all of a sudden, my book on U.S.-China relations is totally different. And now the U.S.-China relationship is changing quickly in real time as I have to write the book. So I've got to fly the plane and build it at the same time. And I still have to do my job at the Washington Post. And inside the government, and now I'm stuck in quarantine like everybody else. And then the election hit. And now we have Donald Trump and Joe Biden running again, and the pandemic is the number one issue. That means China's the number one issue or the number two issue, and the China issue is getting super politicized. And that's bad. And inside the government, I'm thinking, okay, well, before I had to convince people, right, this whole speech that I just gave you, oh, U.S.-China relationship so important, what happens in Beijing doesn't stay in Beijing, the character and actions of the CCP affect us in our lives. In 2019, early 2019, that was a tougher argument to make. But standing here in front of you in 2021, I don't think I have to convince anybody in this room that that's the case. If you spent 2 years living in your basement and not seeing your grandchildren and worrying about getting coronavirus and, figuring out if you could even, losing your job or your family member or your livelihood or your industry, you know that, and we can debate how much, that the actions of the Chinese Communist Party exacerbated your suffering, that what happened there made it worse. That doesn't excuse any of our own mistakes. It doesn't excuse any of our government's mistakes. Just to say that the way that the Chinese government handled this pandemic, which was really the first example we have of what China as a world power looks like, and I'll explain what I mean by that. Let me just check the time. Oh my God, I'm way over. Okay, I'm gonna skip to, I'm gonna go quickly, and then we're gonna take some questions because I do want to hear what you guys have to say. I'm sorry if I went over a little bit. I tend to do that, but this is important. Okay, so now everyone knows that we have to watch the U.S.-China relationship. But meanwhile, inside the government, all these fights are still happening. And I'm writing the book, and I'm sitting there interviewing all these people inside the government, and I'm watching this play out, and it's getting really screwed up. And the first thing that happens is that Xi Jinping calls his friend Donald Trump. And Donald Trump's like, what's going on here? Is everything okay? And Xi Jinping, in 2 phone calls, February 6th and March 26th, is reported exclusively in my book, lies to the President of the United States. He says, it'll go away in warm weather, herbal medicine will treat it, we've got it under control, nothing to worry about. And 2 days after the call, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, is giving a press conference. He says, many people are saying it's going to go away in warm weather. He didn't say many people were saying, was the Chinese president who was covering up the outbreak, who was lying. So Xi Jinping directly inserted fake news, misinformation into our president's head, which came out of his mouth, which came into our policy, which is one reason our response was so screwed up. Meanwhile, the State Department was trying to get our masks, those masks in those factories that we own in China, but we don't really own them. Because when the crisis hit, they nationalized them. And then they blackmailed us with our own masks. And they said, hey, do you want your masks? Do you want your PPE? By the way, we had flown them a bunch of masks while they were covering up the virus in the first months. And then they took those, and then they held our masks, and they said, okay, we have one condition. You have to shut up about the blame, and you have to shut up about the origin of the coronavirus. And for that and many other reasons that I get into in the book, we had to pretend like we didn't know where the coronavirus came from. Even as the Chinese government was covering up the science, jailing the journalists, censoring all of the science, which they continue to this day, hiding all of the early information, lying about the numbers, and they were dangling our masks over our heads. And they did this to every country in the world. Not for China's interests, not for their economic interests, for their political interests. Don't blame us. They blackmailed some countries over Huawei. They blackmailed some over Taiwan. They took this new power that they had as the first mover, because they were the first at everything, first with the virus, first with the lockdowns, first with the information, and they abused it, and exacerbating the suffering and deaths of people all over the world. It was right about that time when I was leaked a couple of State Department cables that indicated that there were some major problems in this lab in Wuhan, which was right next to where the virus broke out. And at that time, as you may remember, it was very impolite to talk about the labs in Wuhan. You weren't allowed to do it. You could get called a lot of nasty names for it. And I work at the Washington Post. I'm not insensitive to that. I don't want to get canceled. I don't want to say the wrong thing. I don't want to play into any, wrong information. And it's true that there was a rise in racism against Asian Americans in our country during that time, and that's terrible. That's a stain on our society and a tragedy for those members of our community. But that had nothing to do with the labs. But I got these cables, and they say that the labs were dangerous, and that diplomats had warned about them, and specifically they had warned about the bad coronaviruses and the risky research they were doing, known as gain-of-function research, and we better do something about it or a pandemic's going to come out of this lab. They said that 2 years before the outbreak. And now I'm looking at this, and sure enough, it seems like a pandemic came out of that city. We don't know if it came from the lab. We still don't know. But it's a bad coronavirus. It's like when Jon Stewart said, if you had an outbreak of chocolatey goodness in Hershey, Pennsylvania, you might want to take a look at the chocolate factory. That's what people inside our government were saying, but they couldn't say it loudly because they were getting blackmailed for our masks and because you could get canceled by the media for mentioning it. But I didn't care. I published the cables. And then all hell broke loose, and Donald Trump said it came from the lab, and then the scientists who were the best friends of the lab said, no, it didn't. And then, the media sided with the scientists and against Trump, and then it got caught up into our politics and into our elections. You guys know the whole story. It got so screwed up we still can't figure it out. Then the World Health Organization comes in, and they hired the best friends of the lab to investigate the lab, and the best friends of the lab say the lab's innocent, and how dare you talk about the lab. And here we are a year and a half later, and we still have no credible investigation into the source of the coronavirus. I'm not saying I know how it broke out. I'm just saying we need to check out these labs. No one's checking out these labs. Why can't we check out these labs? And so as the crisis, and I am going to wrap up because I know I do want to get to your questions. If you guys will stay a little bit longer, I don't want to keep you from the beauty. Oh, well, the sun went down, so. Over the course of 2020, as Donald Trump started to realize that his good friend Xi Jinping had lied to him, that they weren't actually really good friends, that he had tricked him into thinking the pandemic was not a big deal, and now he's going to lose the election over it, right? He thought he didn't want to do anything on the coronavirus because he didn't want to admit it was a big problem. He didn't want to tank the economy. Now he's going to lose, and he kind of knows it. So he releases all of his national security officials to do everything on China that they had wanted to do for the last 4 years that they weren't able to do. They did an executive order against TikTok. Remember that? They're like, oh, we're going to ban TikTok. My reaction was like, is that really the most important, like the girls of the video, is that the thing that we're going to, is that number one priority? I don't think so. But anyway, they banned TikTok. And then, they did the genocide designation, the Uyghur sanctions, and all this stuff. And they also put out a bunch of information about the labs. They basically said, we think the labs did it. And then the rioters came to Washington, overtook the Capitol, then everything was shut down, and it was just fences. It looked like the green zone. I was like living in a war zone for a couple months at least. And in comes the Biden administration, and they have to untangle all of this, right? And they weren't there. They don't know the score, and they don't know what happened with the labs. They weren't reading the intelligence. They don't even know there was no transition. In other words, because Trump never conceded. So most of the times you would have like the State Department, here's the box of information on Uyghurs. Okay, thank you. That never happened. So they're coming in with their 2016 mindset, and they're trying to pick through it all, and they're doing it, but they're doing it very slowly. And, the Chinese government sees that, and they're increasing their strategy at pace. And now inside the Biden administration, there's a fight over what to do. Because, you have John Kerry who wants to, fix climate change, and then you have the human rights people who are like, well, we can't do that with solar power panels that are made by Uyghur slaves. How are we going to solve climate change if we're buying the solar panels that are made with Uyghur slaves? We can't do that. That's one of the fights that is happening right now. The fight in Wall Street is still going on. The fight in our tech industry, the fights on our campuses, and the fight inside of our Congress and inside of our national security system. So, Donald Trump flipped over the chessboard, right? And you could say that was a good thing, right? And not to say he did everything right. If you read my book, you'll see it's not pro-Trump. It's not anti-Trump. I'm a registered Democrat, but my basic premise is both parties are screwed, and they're both corrupt, and they're both, basically dysfunctional at this point. And so my criticisms of the U.S. government are not party specific, but what I say is that this is the most important thing in our foreign policy. We cannot leave it to the China hands. We cannot leave it to the people who've messed up this relationship over the last 40 years. We need to recognize that our grand bet on China failed. Not because it wasn't a good bet to make, but for whatever reason, it failed. And we need a new strategic response. That means we have to be clear-eyed about what we're dealing with. And that is Xi Jinping, who is a dictator for life, a thug, a criminal, committing a genocide. and a party in the CCP that's taking over all aspects of Chinese society in a way that's taking them backward, in ways that I call it the Great Leap Backward. And that's just the way it is, and that's something that we have to be clear-eyed about. Then we have to realize all of these choices will be difficult, that all of our responses will have costs and risks and place different American values in opposition to each other. And it's going to be tough. And the most important thing we have to do is depoliticize the issue, because the more politics takes over the China issue, the worse it's going to be. And then we have to include everyone who hasn't been part of the discussion, and that's why I'm so thrilled to be here tonight having this discussion with you. And with that, I'll take your questions. So I know I went over time. Do we have a few minutes for questions? Or okay? Yes, sir. Please just tell me your name so I know what I'm talking
between Theodore McCarrick and the CCP with regard to the Vatican.
to. You're talking about Cardinal McCarrick, who was
used to be Cardinal.
right, defrocked and incredibly accused of horrible things. Right. So I haven't done a lot of research into this story. Here's what I'll tell you. I have a couple of things on this. It's clear from the Vatican's report that McCarrick was doing back-channel diplomacy for the Obama administration from basically the whole time. Now, it's also clear that McCarrick was very close to two people in the Obama administration who were still in the Biden administration. One is Dennis McDonough, and the other one was Joe Biden. McCarrick officiated Beau Biden's wedding. Think about that for a second. Now, what the Biden and Obama people say was like, oh, we didn't know. We didn't know any of that stuff, okay? Now, because admittedly, this is not a story that I followed a lot, but what I'm confident saying is that they should have known. And there was enough evidence in 2008 that they should have known. And so I don't know if they knew and ignored it, or they didn't have enough processes to make sure that they would have known. And if you read the Vatican report, what it says in there is pretty clear. It says that McCarrick was using his wasta, his influence with the Biden people, the Obama people at that time, but including Joe Biden, to protect himself against what was coming from the other side. And that as the pressure mounted on him, he would say, oh, well, you guys need me, because it wasn't just China. He was doing stuff with Cuba, mostly the Cuba stuff, actually. That was what they really used him for. He would go back and forth to Cuba. And the Vatican and the Cubans were like, can't we go around this McCarrick guy? It seems like something shady's going on here in those early years when we weren't quite sure, but there was enough smoke that they should have backed away from him. And McCarrick was very savvy, according to this Vatican report, about using his position with the Obama people to protect himself until it became too late, it became too obvious. So I've never actually seen anybody write about it. It's really interesting. No one's ever asked me that question before. And it's not in the book because it happened before the Trump administration. But if you're asking me my personal opinion, I have no problem telling you that, I think it's pretty clear from the open source reporting that they used him for all sorts of back-channel diplomacy. And in some cases, it actually worked. But, they should have known. Or they should have had enough suspicion that they shouldn't have done that. That's my honest opinion. Yes?
My name is Kathy. 5 years out, where is crypto going to be in China, U.S.?
It's a great question. The crypto story with China is so funny because for all of this time, a huge proportion of Bitcoin and other crypto mining happened in China, okay? And the reason that they did that is because, again, the way I think of the Chinese Communist Party, people are like, are they fascist? No, not really. Are they communist? No. It's like a mafia organ. It's like the cartel, okay? It's like a organized crime. Have you ever seen The Sopranos? It's like that. If they go around to every country, they're like, oh, nice country guy there. It'd be a shame if something happened to it. That's how they operate. It's the biggest extortion ring on the planet. That's how they operate. That's the best way to understand how they actually operate. And I don't want to. Everyone saw the end of this. I don't want to spoil anyone if you're still waiting on to binge it. But what happens at the end? Tony kills Chrissy. He strangles Chrissy. Right. That's how they are. It doesn't matter if they're family. It doesn't matter if they're in the same. They kill each other. What's going on inside the CCP now is they're killing each other, all the time. Purges and corruption. All this. They're just killing each other. And the businessmen falling out of windows, falling off of walls, disappearing in dungeons. And so the crypto is an example of that because they have a closed economy. And they actually just banned Bitcoin And they have their own proprietary digital currency and their own proprietary cryptocurrency, which they want to control. So why would they spend 20 years mining Bitcoin more than any organization in the world and then ban Bitcoin, right? And if you think of that as a strategy for their country, it doesn't make any sense. But if you think of it as a strategy for a criminal organization, it makes perfect sense. Because the reason that they could mine Bitcoin is because they don't have to pay for energy. So they control, it's all dirty coal anyway in Xinjiang. So the biggest cost of mining Bitcoin is the energy expense. But if you run a country and you're a criminal organization, well, the energy is free. And they just build 100 more coal plants, and then they have 100 more Bitcoin farms. Now they're getting all the money. So they did it for the cash, all right? And then when it got too powerful, when it got too big, they did the same thing that they did to the online gaming industry and the tutoring industry and the ride-sharing industry and Alibaba and Ant Financial and Jack Ma. They crushed them. And they're like, no, this is ours now. So that's what happened. They were the biggest Bitcoin miners in the world, and then they just made it illegal on a turn of a dime, because they calculated that the cash influx wasn't as important to them as the control. And now they're going to build their own cryptocurrency, or they already have it. And the point of that is to, you can't trade Chinese currency, right? It's like, I've been to China a handful of times. I can't go in now anymore because they banned all the Washington Post reporters, threw them all out, But when I was there, you get the Chinese currency. It doesn't mesh. You can't trade it. You can only use it inside China. So how did they go around the world buying up industries and companies and continents and countries? They can't even spend their own money. It's because it was our money. It's because what I was talking about before. They took our cash and used it to buy out us, to add to their pile. And the crypto is another example of that. So now they're building their own cryptocurrency, and they're going to use that and their own digital currency to try to get their money out and to get other money in. And so if you have look at a country like, El Salvador. They went to all Bitcoin. Bitcoin's like now their national currency. Well, that's great for China, because then they don't have to worry about sanctions. They don't have to worry about the World Bank. They don't have to worry about, SWIFT, interchanges and international banking. So they're devising a controlled cryptocurrency so that they can definitely corrupt, and the Bitcoin thing, that was good cash while it lasted. One more.
What happened to the tariffs and the so-called trade deal? I mean, that was like every single day, and then COVID hit.
Right. Yeah. So I tell a story in the book about the trade war that is a little different than the story you might have heard by reading the Wall Street Journal. And there's a good reason for that. It's because the Wall Street Journal covered the trade war as a trade matter. But it wasn't just a trade matter. It was a national security fight. And I covered it from that angle. And what I mean by that is, if you're Donald Trump and you say to your people, go get me a deal, go get me a trade deal. And the first thing that they say is, okay, let's see if we can do this without tariffs. That's what happened at Mar-a-Lago. Remember, they had the most beautiful piece of chocolate cake you ever saw in the world. And Jared Kushner and Ivanka's children sang to Xi Jinping in Chinese. And, then he bombed Syria, and he's like, hey, I just bombed Syria. And that was the first try. And they were like, okay, we're going to come up with a trade deal without tariffs or without any tariffs. But it didn't work. And the Chinese wouldn't do it. So then the national security people came in, and they're like, okay, now we're going to have tariffs. And that was advertised to the American people as a pressure tactic to bring them to the table for a deal. And what the national security people were really thinking is that we don't care about the deal. And they're never going to make a real deal. In other words, if you come from if you're a national security person, you think the Chinese are not going to change their industrial policy. They're not going to stop subsidizing their companies. If they weren't going to do it 20 years ago, they're not going to do it now when they're even more powerful, more rich than ever before. So they structured the tariffs in a way that would put pain on their economy, especially in the high-tech industry, to throw sand into the machine to slow them down. Now, that has nothing to do with the trade negotiations. But the funny thing about the U.S. government is that the people doing the trade negotiations aren't the ones who craft the tariffs. So the national security people are like, oh, you want some tariffs? Okay, here's some tariffs. And their goal, they were thinking that the deal would never happen and the tariffs would stay forever. And if the tariffs stay forever, well, then we can slow them down as we speed up. And what do we need to slow them down on? The emerging and foundational technologies, the 5G, the AI, the blockchain, the crypto, all of that stuff that they're beating us at. Because let's be honest, they're beating us at all of that stuff. the computer-brain interfaces, even some of the viruses. Why do you think they've got all the virus, labs? It's because they're way ahead on a lot of these scientific fields because we funded them and built their industry. So anyway, the point is, so the trade, it worked in a sense that they started to negotiate. But as time started ticking out at the end of 2019, Trump had to run for re-election. So he goes to his trade people and he says, I'm paraphrasing, he says, okay, listen, we need a deal now. Enough with this tariffs and stuff. And let's just get a deal. Get whatever deal you can. So that's what they did. They got a crappy deal. Like, what's $50 billion worth of soybeans in a $6 trillion pandemic? It's laughable, right? And it's good for the soybean farmers, don't get me wrong, but it's not a real thing. They didn't change any of the IP stuff. They didn't change any of their laws. They didn't change any of their industrial abuses, any of their trade practices, none of it. So they gave us okay, we're going to buy $50 billion worth of soybeans. Okay, great. And then Trump got up and gave a ceremony on January 14th, 2020. This is the start of the last chapter of the book. And he says, we've done it. Mission accomplished. I told you I was going to fix the U.S.-China relationship, and now we've done it. You're welcome. And one day later, the pandemic information started coming in. One day later. So the whole détente, all of the benefits of that trade deal lasted exactly one day. And the Chinese officials who were in Washington must have known, because they knew that they had the pandemic. We didn't know. They didn't say anything. They didn't mention it. Never came up. Neither side brought it up. So they have this ceremony. We fixed it. The trade war is over. It's going to be lovely. We're all going to live together in peace and harmony. They got on the plane and left. Nobody said a word about the pandemic. Then the information started pouring in. So that's why the trade deal didn't produce the benefit. The benefit was supposed to be we're supposed to get along now. Now, the tariffs are still there because the trade deal was so crappy they couldn't justify taking off all the tariffs. They could only justify taking off some of them. And they kept most of them. Actually, the majority of them. And the national security people were like, good. You know why? Because we're not trying to change them. We're trying to slow them down and protect ourselves. And this is sort of like, this is actually a good place to end because, a lot of people are still of this mind that like, oh, we need a policy to change China. And, what a lot of people started to realize is that, oh, no, that's not our job. China's development is going to be determined by the Chinese people one way or the other. And it was hubris to think that we're going to change them to be like us. They're not going to change to be like us. They're going to change in whatever way they're going to change. But the thing that we can do is we can raise the costs and the pressures on them for the worst stuff, the genocide, the trade stuff, the economic abuse, the pandemic stuff. And then we can protect ourselves. So now we have all of these tariffs. And, it's not going to get us another trade deal. We're not going to have another trade. I mean, we could have one, but it's not going to do anything. But what the tariffs do is they slow them down and it gives us a chance to speed up. That's not what was advertised. I acknowledge it's not what we told the American people, but that's what's going on. And are we doing that? Not really. We're going to give some nuclear submarines to Australia in 2040? Okay, but what about 5G? You know what I mean? What about it's not really about nuclear submarines. Why don't we use this opportunity where we have a limited amount of time before the Chinese get so big and powerful that they can tell us to go screw ourselves to fix our own society? In other words, the only real way to compete with China is to be the best version of ourselves, to stand up for the things we believe in, and to live our values, as corny as that sounds, to stand up for human rights and the rule of law and fair trade and free markets and open societies and free press and all of that stuff that we're supposed to be basing our society on, that we've, more or less succeeded on, but with, let's face it, some serious errors along the way. If we do that before the window closes, before Xi Jinping and the Communist Party of China is able to become so big and powerful that we can't do anything about it, then we have a chance to win this competition. And the tariffs are helping slow them down while we do that, but we still have to do that. And we can't change China, but we can change ourselves.